A king doesn't pass quietly into the night. He takes the oxygen out of the room. When the city's most feared Enigma was wheeled into triage, his failing body was a bomb ready to take us all with him. Elite doctors froze. Hardened alphas choked on his suffocating aura. They said he was already a ghost. They were wrong. Sometimes it takes the person society deems the weakest to pull a monster back from the edge of hell. Neon light filtered through the cracked blinds of Trauma Bay 4, casting long bruised shadows across the linoleum. Jesse Hayes rubbed the bridge of his nose. The clock above the crash cart read 3:14 a.m. The graveyard shift at St. Jude's was usually a predictable parade of drunk drivers and petty gang brawls. Tonight felt different. The air pressure in the ward had been dropping for an hour, heavy and static, like the moments before a severe thunderstorm. Then the double doors at the ambulance bay exploded open. There were no sirens, just the violent screech of tires and the frantic shouts of men who killed for a living. Jesse dropped his stale coffee. It splattered across the floor, a brown puddle instantly trampled by custom Italian leather shoes. 5 men surged into the glaring light of the ER. They were massive. Alphas, all of them, tailored suits torn and stained their faces, twisted in a cocktail of rage and sheer terror. But it wasn't their presence that made the triage nurses stop in their tracks. It was the scent rolling off the stretcher they pushed. It hit Jesse like a physical blow. Crushed iron, ozone, and burning pine. It was a scent that didn't belong to an alpha. It was heavier, denser, ancient. An enigma. Jesse had read about them in medical journals, a genetic anomaly, a dynamic so dominant it made regular alphas submit on instinct. He had never smelled one. Now the scent was coating the back of his throat, tasting like ash. "Get a doctor now," the lead alpha roared. He was a mountain of a man, his right cheek laid open by shrapnel, but he didn't seem to notice. He was hyperventilating, his own pheromones spiraling out of control, a panicked, sour stench of rotting fruit that clashed violently with the Enigma's crushing aura. Jesse didn't wait for the attending physician. He vaulted over the nurse's station and sprinted to the gurney. "Back off," Jesse snapped, shoving a suited alpha twice his size. The man's snarled eyes flashing crimson, a feral growl vibrating in his chest. "You touch him, Omega, and I'll break your neck." "He's bleeding out from 3 separate entry wounds," Jesse said, his voice flat, devoid of the submissive tremor the alpha expected. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began cutting away the ruined fabric of the Enigma shirt. "You want him dead? Keep standing in my way. You want him breathing? Move your heavy ass to the waiting room." The alpha blinked, the sheer audacity of the Omega short-circuiting his aggression. He stepped back. Jesse finally looked at the man on the table. Roman Gallagher, the undisputed king of the Northern Syndicates. A man who supposedly controlled politicians, judges, and the docks with an iron fist. Right now, he was just a slab of failing meat. His skin was an ashen, terrifying gray. Thick dark tattoos coiled around his muscular arms, disappearing into the blood-soaked bandages hastily wrapped around his torso. His chest was barely moving. Dr. Aries, a seasoned beta surgeon, finally jogged into the bay, pulling on his gloves. He took one look at Roman, inhaled the suffocating air, and faltered. Pressure is dropping," Jesse called out, attaching the ECG leads to Roman's clammy skin. The monitor immediately began a frantic, erratic beeping. "Heart rate is 140 and irregular. He's in hypovolemic shock. 2 large-bore IVs now. I need O negative. Heirs stepped forward, but his hands were visibly shaking. The Enigma's body was dying, and in response, his biology was triggering a massive defensive pheromone dump. It was a localized biological weapon. The alphas in the room were already dropping to their knees, clutching their heads, incapacitated by the instinctual urge to submit to a dying god. Even Arisa Beta looked pale and nauseous. "Dr. Aris," Jesse snapped. "Focus." I can't," Aris stammered, stepping back, sweat beading on his forehead. "The air. It's too heavy." Jesse gritted his teeth. The monitor shrieked. Roman's blood pressure was tanking. 70/40. A dying Enigma was dragging the entire room down with him. Jesse felt the pressure, too. It screamed at his Omega biology to curl up, to hide, to weep for the dying apex predator. His knees trembled. His lungs burned. But Jesse hadn't survived 5 years in the city's worst trauma center by bowing to biology. He slapped the side of the gurney, the sharp sound cutting through the heavy air. "Crash cart," Jesse yelled to a paralyzed junior nurse. "Get me the damn crash cart. We are moving him to OR2. Now. Push." He grabbed the head of the bed. Roman's head rolled to the side, facing Jesse. His eyes were closed, dark lashes resting on hollow cheeks. Up close, beneath the smell of copper and death, Jesse caught a fleeting whisper of what the man smelled like before the violence. Amber and old paper. "You aren't dying on my shift, Gallagher," Jesse muttered, shoving the heavy gurney down the hall. "I have too much paperwork to do." Operating room 2 was freezing sterile and blindingly bright. It didn't matter. The suffocating aura of the dying Enigma had followed them in clinging to the walls like black mold. Dr. Aris stood over the operating table, a scalpel trembling in his hand. 2 assist nurses had already fled the room to vomit, overwhelmed by the sheer density of Roman's distress pheromones. The air was physically thick-tasting of rusted metal and burning wires. "I have to clamp the descending aorta," Aris rasped, his voice tight. "But he's throwing clots. The tissue damage. It's too extensive." "Duh! Suctioning," Jesse said smoothly, stepping in close. He held the tube, clearing the dark, pooling liquid from Roman's open abdominal cavity. Beep! 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 The flatline tone was a singular, terrifying note. "He's coding!" Aris shouted, dropping his instruments. "Chest compressions!" Jesse shoved the beta aside and climbed onto the step stool. He locked his hands over the center of Roman's broad chest and pushed. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Enigma's ribs shifted under his palms. Roman's body was a furnace radiating an intense, unnatural heat. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Jesse barked between compressions. Aris fumbled with the syringe, his hands slick with sweat. He injected the line. Nothing. Roman's body convulsed. Not a heartbeat, but a violent neurological spasm. And then the room simply ceased to have oxygen. The Enigma's biology recognized death was imminent. In a final desperate evolutionary mechanism, Roman's glands flooded the room with a lethal dose of command pheromones. It wasn't meant to attack. It was meant to force any nearby pack to save him. But the sheer volume was toxic. Aris collapsed. The beta surgeon hit the floor, gasping for air, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. Jesse kept pumping. His own head was swimming. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. The pressure in his skull was agonizing, a high-pitched ringing, drowning out the flatlining monitor. His Omega instincts were screaming at him to submit, to bare his neck, to surrender to the void pulling the Enigma down. No. Jesse locked his jaw. He didn't stop the compressions. But he knew medical intervention wasn't going to be enough. Roman's nervous system was short-circuiting. The Enigma was fighting his own body, killing himself faster with the stress response. Jesse needed to ground him. Without breaking his rhythm, Jesse reached to the collar of his scrubs. He ripped the heavy scent-blocking patch off his scent gland. For 5 years, Jesse had hidden his dynamic at work. Omegas and trauma wards were considered liabilities too fragile to handle the gore, too easily distracted by the pheromones of suffering alphas. Jesse had kept his scent suppressed, buried under chemicals and blockers. Now he let it go. He forcefully pushed his own pheromones into the room. Not a distress signal, not a submissive surrender. He released a concentrated heavy blanket of grounding scent, vetiver warm honey and rain-soaked earth. It was a profoundly rare iteration of Omega pheromones, maternal, fiercely protective, and deeply calming. The two scents collided over the operating table. The Enigma's violent thunderstorm hit the Omega's ancient forest. The physical reaction was instantaneous. Jesse felt blood drip from his nose, his capillaries bursting under the sheer strain of projecting his aura against an Enigma's death throes. He smeared the blood away with his shoulder and leaned down, pressing his cheek against Roman's sweaty forehead. "Stop fighting," Jesse whispered fiercely, his voice a low vibration against Roman's skin. He pushed his scent harder, wrapping it around the suffocating panic in the room. "You're safe. Stand down. Stand the fuck down." It was a battle fought entirely in the air, a clash of primal biology. Jesse's knees buckled, but he gripped the edge of the operating table, refusing to retreat. He visualized his scent as a heavy iron blanket, throwing it over the sparking, out-of-control wires of Roman's nervous system. Slowly, agonizingly, the oppressive weight in the room began to fracture. Roman's chest hitched. The monitor gave a single, hesitant beep. Then another. Jesse gasped, stepping back, his chest heaving. The flat line broke into a jagged, fragile rhythm. 60 beats per minute. The violent storm of ozone and burning pine receded, pulling back into the man on the table, leaving behind a sterile, cold operating room. Dr. Harris groaned slowly, pushing himself up from the floor. He looked at the monitor, then at Jesse, his eyes wide with disbelief. "His heart," Harris whispered. "It restarted. How?" Jesse wiped the blood from his upper lip, his hands trembling violently now that the adrenaline was fading. He quickly slapped a spare blocker patch from his pocket onto his neck. "Epinephrine." Jesse lied, his voice entirely steady. "Get back to work, doctor. You have an artery to patch." 72 hours later, the silence in the VIP wing was deafening. St. Jude's top-floor suite had been completely locked down. Two massive alphas in tailored charcoal suits stood outside the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. They didn't like being near the room. Even comatose Roman Gallagher leaked a residual pressure that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Jesse didn't care. He was tired. His bones ached, his head throbbed, and he was running on 3 hours of sleep and stale vending machine pretzels. He pushed through the heavy oak door, ignoring the suspicious glares of the guards. The suite looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital room, save for the bank of monitors and the IV poles. Roman lay in the center of the oversized bed. The gray pallor had faded from his skin, replaced by a warm olive hue. The network of wires and tubes feeding into his body seemed almost comical against his sheer bulk. Jesse walked over, checking the chart at the end of the bed. Vitals were stable. The tissue regeneration was terrifyingly fast. Another perk of the Enigma genetics. "All right, Gallagher," Jesse murmured, pulling a pair of latex gloves from the wall dispenser with a sharp snap. "Let's see the damage." He pulled back the thick blanket. Roman's torso was heavily bandaged, but Jesse needed to check the surgical sites for infection. He began to carefully peel back the medical tape over the primary bullet wound on Roman's right side. The man's body was a map of violence. Old knife scars intersected with bullet grazes. Tattoos of ravens and geometric crowns twisted over the heavy slabs of muscle. Jesse worked methodically, his face a mask of clinical detachment. He cleaned the angry red stitches with saline, the sharp smell of antiseptic cutting through the faint lingering scent of amber and paper. Suddenly, the air pressure in the room spiked. It wasn't a slow build. It was an instant localized vacuum. Jesse froze, his hand hovering over Roman's ribs. Before Jesse could blink, a massive hand shot out, moving with terrifying speed. Thick fingers clamped around Jesse's wrist like a steel vise. The grip was tight enough to bruise bone. Jesse gasped, his eyes flying up to Roman's face. The Enigma's eyes were open. They were a startling, piercing shade of pale gray, completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a predator, waking up in a trap. Roman's chest heaved, pulling against the monitors. He didn't speak. He just stared at Jesse, a low, menacing rumble building in his chest. A clear, instinctual warning. Any other Omega would have dropped to their knees. Any Alpha would have bared their throat. Jesse just sighed. "You're pulling your central line." Jesse said, his tone entirely conversational. Roman's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion breaking his lethal glare. His voice, when it came, was a rusted, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet room. "Who?" "I'm Jesse, your nurse, and currently the only thing keeping you from bleeding out on these very expensive Egyptian cotton sheets." Jesse met the Enigma's stare dead on. He didn't pull his wrist back. He just waited. Roman didn't let go. His thumb moved slightly, pressing against the pulse point on Jesse's wrist. The Enigma's nostrils flared. He was scenting the air, looking for a threat, looking for a dynamic. Jesse had his blockers back on, but close physical contact bypassed the patches. Roman was reading the faint lingering traces of vetiver and honey trapped against Jesse's skin. His shadow passed over Roman's pale eyes. The aggressive, suffocating pressure in the room suddenly dissolved, replaced by a heavy, probing curiosity. "It was you!" Roman whispered, his voice barely louder than the hum of the heart monitor. "In the dark." Jesse's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I was drowning." Roman continued his grip on Jesse's wrist, loosening just a fraction, though he didn't let go. "There was mud, cold, and then honey, vetiver." Roman's eyes narrowed. Scanning Jesse's unremarkable scrubs, his tired eyes the dark bags under them. "You're an Omega." "I'm a healthcare professional," Jesse corrected sharply, finally yanking his wrist free. He rubbed the reddened skin. "And you are a terrible patient. Lie back down before you tear the internal sutures." Roman didn't move. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his massive frame dwarfing the bed. The monitors immediately began to chirp in protest of his elevated heart rate. He ignored them, keeping his intense gaze locked on Jesse. My men?" Roman asked. "Outside, pacing holes in the carpet." Jesse grabbed a fresh roll of gauze. "Now lie down or I'll sedate you. And don't think I won't. I have access to elephant tranquilizers, and I'm not afraid to use them." A beat of silence passed. The Mafia king stared at the cynical, exhausted Omega. Slowly, incredibly, the corner of Roman's mouth twitched upward in a ghost of a smirk. He lowered himself back onto the pillows, though his eyes never left Jesse's face. "I'd like to see you try, little bird," Roman murmured. "Don't call me that," Jesse snapped, taping down the fresh bandage with unnecessary force. "I saved your life. The least you can do is learn my name." Roman tilted his head, watching the way Jesse moved with competent, fearless precision. The Enigma inhaled deeply, committing the faint scent of the nurse to memory. "Jesse." Roman tested the name, the syllables heavy on his tongue. "You pulled me out of hell, Jesse." "It's my job," Jesse replied, grabbing the chart and turning his back on the mob boss. "Don't read into it." "I read into everything," Roman said quietly to the Omega's back. "And I always repay my debts." Jesse paused at the door, a cold shiver running down his spine despite the warm room. He looked back over his shoulder. The Enigma was watching him still and calculating a terrifying intelligence burning in his pale eyes. Jesse realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that surviving the surgery was the easy part. He had just anchored himself to a monster, and monsters never let go of their anchors. By the end of week 2, the VIP wing of St. Jude's didn't belong to the hospital anymore. It belonged to the Gallagher Syndicate. Men with cauliflower ears and $1,000 suits occupied the waiting rooms. They drank the terrible cafeteria coffee out of tiny paper cups and stared down anyone who walked out of the elevator. The nursing staff was terrified. The attending physicians suddenly found reasons to delegate rounds. Jesse just found it irritating. "Move," Jesse said, nudging a heavily tattooed alpha aside with a cart loaded with clean linens. The alpha, a guy whose file named him Donovan, scowled. He was 6'4" and smelled like cheap cologne and aggressive posturing. He didn't budge. "Nobody goes in without clearance. I have clearance. It's called a nursing degree, and the fact that your boss's chest tube needs changing." Jesse set his tone flat. He didn't break eye contact. He didn't mask his irritation. "Now, unless you plan on sterilizing your hands and packing a surgical wound, get out of my way." Donovan's jaw locked. A low warning growl started in his throat. The door to the suite clicked open. Roman leaned against the doorframe. He looked entirely different from the gray dying man Jesse had resuscitated. Roman was dressed in dark gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt that stretched tight over his broad chest. The bandages bulked under the fabric. He looked pale, and his movements were stiff, but the crushing heavy aura of the Enigma was fully restored. It rolled out into the hallway, suffocating and absolute. Donovan immediately snapped his mouth shut. He dropped his gaze, exposing his throat in a reflexive display of submission. "Let him in, Donovan," Roman said. His voice was a quiet, grating rumble. He didn't look at his guard. His pale gray eyes were fixed entirely on Jesse. Jesse pushed the cart past the subdued alpha and into the room. He didn't thank Roman. He just parked the cart next to the bed and began arranging his supplies. Forceps, gauze, saline, medical tape. "You're terrorizing my men." Roman noted, slowly walking back to the edge of the bed and sitting down. He winced slightly, a tiny tightening of the muscles around his eyes. Your men are standing in front of the biohazard bins. It's a health code violation, Jesse replied. He snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. Shirt off. Roman complied. He pulled the shirt over his head, the movement tight and controlled. The primary wound on his right side was healing with an unnatural, terrifying speed. The bruised flesh had already turned yellow and green, the jagged stitches holding the newly knit muscle together. Jesse went to work. He cleaned the site with mechanical efficiency. He didn't linger. He didn't look at Roman's face. Roman, however, watched Jesse's every move. He analyzed the Omega. He noted the dark circles under Jesse's eyes, the slight tremor in his fingers that came from too much caffeine and too little sleep. You wear heavy blockers, Roman said suddenly. Jesse paused, pressing a fresh square of gauze over the stitches. Hospital policy. Omegas aren't supposed to distract the patients. They don't work on me. Jesse's hand stilled. He finally looked up. Roman was leaning forward slightly. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. I can smell the chemicals, Roman said softly, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on Jesse's arm stand up. But underneath it, vetiver, honey, wet earth. You smell like an anchor. I smell like antibacterial soap. Jesse shot back, taping the gauze down securely. He stepped back, tossing his gloves into the waste bin. You're healing fast. Dr. Aris will likely discharge you in 2 days. Then you can go back to threatening politicians, and I can go back to treating car crash victims. You think it's that simple? Roman asked. He tilted his head. The calculating look returned to his eyes. I prefer things simple. My biology doesn't. Roman stood up. He was a full head taller than Jesse. The air in the room grew heavy, not with aggression, but with a dense gravitational pull. When my nervous system was collapsing, my body looked for a tether. You provided one. You forced your scent down my throat and commanded my heart to beat. Jesse swallowed hard. His mouth was suddenly dry. It was a medical intervention. It was a bond, Roman corrected. He took a single step closer. The heat radiating from his large frame was palpable. My genetics are designed to conquer Jesse, to dominate. When I was dying, I couldn't. You bypassed my defenses. Now my instincts recognize your scent as the only safe harbor in this city. When I sleep, I don't dream of the men who shot me. I dream of honey and rain. Jesse took a step back, his back hitting the linen cart. Panic sharp and bright flared in his chest. I'm not a walking Xanax for a mob boss, Gallagher. I saved your life. We're square. We haven't even begun, Roman murmured. He didn't close the distance. He just watched Jesse retreat. I'll see you tomorrow, little bird. Jesse turned and walked out. He didn't run, but it took everything in him not to. Later that night, the illusion of safety shattered. Jesse was at the nurse's station charting blood pressure readings when the elevator chimed. A man in green scrubs walked out, pushing a mop bucket. His face was obscured by a surgical mask and a blue cap. Something was wrong. The man's gait was too purposeful. Cleaners at 3 a.m. shuffled. They listened to podcasts. They dragged their feet. This man moved with the coiled tension of a loaded spring. Worse, Jesse caught a sudden sharp spike of scent cutting through the hospital bleach. Fear, sour, acrid fear. The man walked straight past the supply closet and turned toward the VIP wing. Donovan and another guard were stationed at the double doors. Jesse didn't think. He dropped his pen. Hey, Jesse shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ward. The man in the scrubs froze. He whipped around his hand, plunging into the front pocket of his loose shirt. Donovan reacted a second too late. The man pulled a suppressed pistol. Jesse was already moving. He grabbed the heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall bracket beside the desk, yanked the pin, and hurled it. He didn't aim for the man's head. He aimed for center mass. The heavy red cylinder slammed into the assassin's chest just as he squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, shattering the glass of the nurse's station. The man stumbled backward, gasping for air. Donovan tackled him. The impact sounded like a car crash. The assassin hit the linoleum, the gun skittering across the floor. Jesse stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of fear. The door to the VIP suite slammed open. Roman stepped out, a heavy silver revolver already in his hand. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The bleeding assassin pinned to the floor by Donovan, the shattered glass, and Jesse standing in the middle of the hallway, breathing hard, unarmed. Roman's eyes locked onto Jesse. The Enigma's pheromones flooded the corridor, a suffocating, terrifying wave of absolute violence. It wasn't directed at Jesse. It was a shield wrapping around the Omega heavy and possessive. "Are you hurt?" Roman's voice wasn't a question. It was a demand. "No," Jesse rasped. Roman looked down at the assassin struggling under his guard. The Enigma's eyes went dead. "Take him to the basement," Roman ordered Donovan. "Find out who sent him, then get rid of him." Jesse watched the men drag the bleeding assassin toward the service elevator. He looked at Roman. The mob boss wasn't looking at the hitman. He was still watching Jesse, his expression unreadable. Jesse realized then that the hospital couldn't protect him. The world he had anchored himself to had just breached the walls. Roman Gallagher was discharged on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Jesse's life began to quietly, systematically dismantle itself. It started with the coffee. Jesse walked into the break room to find a sleek commercial-grade espresso machine sitting on the counter. A small black card was propped against it. It had a single letter embossed in silver G. Then came the commute. Jesse lived in a cramped, drafty apartment above a dry cleaner in the East End. His walk to the subway was a gauntlet of flickering streetlights and shady alleys. On Thursday night, as he walked home from a double shift, he noticed a black Lincoln Navigator idling at the end of his block. It followed him, keeping pace at a crawling speed exactly 50 feet behind. When Jesse reached his door, the SUV parked. It was still there when he woke up. On Friday, his landlord called to say his rent had been paid in full for the next 5 years. Jesse snapped. He didn't call the police. The police worked for Roman. Instead, Jesse waited until the shift change, walked out of the hospital, and marched straight to the idling black Navigator. He slammed his fist against the tinted driver's side window. The glass rolled down smoothly. A massive beta in a suit looked at him blankly. "Take me to him," Jesse demanded. The beta didn't argue. He unlocked the back door. 30 minutes later, the SUV pulled through the wrought iron gates of a sprawling estate in the hills above the city. The house was a fortress of glass and dark stone, surrounded by towering pines and silent men holding automatic weapons. Jesse was escorted through the heavy oak front doors and into a massive library. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, but the room smelled heavily of cigar smoke, expensive bourbon, and the crushing, familiar ozone of the Enigma. Roman was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose the thick, dark ink covering his forearms. He was reviewing a ledger. He looked up as Jesse entered, and a flicker of genuine satisfaction crossed his face. "I was wondering how long it would take you to lose your temper," Roman said, closing the ledger. "Call off your dogs," Jesse said, stepping fully into the room. He refused to sit in the plush leather chairs opposite the desk. He stood his ground. "Take back the rent money and get that stupid coffee machine out of my break room." "The coffee in that hospital was a crime against humanity," Roman replied smoothly. He stood up, walking slowly around the desk. His movements were fluid again. The injury was already a ghost. "You don't own me," Jesse spat. "I did my job. I saved your life. I'm not a piece of territory you can mark." Roman stopped a few feet away. He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. He looked at Jesse, his pale eyes tracking the angry flush on the Omega's cheeks. "You think this is about gratitude?" Roman asked softly. "I think this is about control. You're an enigma. You can't stand the idea of someone having leverage over you, so you're trying to buy me." Roman let out a low, humorless laugh. It was a sound that scraped against the heavy silence of the room. "You have a very high opinion of your own cynicism, Jesse." Roman pushed off the desk and closed the distance between them. Jesse forced his feet to stay planted, even as the Enigma's heavy aura pressed against him, a physical weight in the air. "I'm not trying to buy you," Roman said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I'm trying to survive." Jesse frowned. "You're healed. My tissue is healed. My biology is fundamentally altered." Roman reached out. He didn't grab Jesse's wrist this time. Instead, he gently brushed the back of his knuckles against the edge of Jesse's jaw, right where the scent blocker patch sat on his neck. Jesse flinched, but he didn't pull away. The touch was unnervingly gentle for a man who ordered executions. When an enigma faces systemic death, Roman explained, his eyes darkening. The nervous system initiates a hard reset. It looks for a biological anchor to stabilize the heart rate and blood pressure. You offered your scent. My body latched onto it. So, unlatch. Jesse whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I can't." Roman's fingers traced the edge of the patch. "My syndicate is at war. The Italians in the south tried to kill me. My lieutenants are anxious. The stress is constant. And every time my cortisol spikes, every time my blood pressure rises, my brain triggers a panic response because it thinks I'm dying on that operating table again." Roman leaned down, his face inches from Jesse's. "The only thing that stops the panic is you, your scent, the memory of your pulse under my hand. When my men are parked outside your apartment, it's not because I'm guarding you like property. It's because knowing you're safe is the only way I can sleep at night." Jesse stared at him, stunned. He had studied Enigma biology, but the texts were clinical. They didn't describe this. They didn't describe the absolute terrifying vulnerability of an apex predator addicted to a cynical, overworked nurse. "You're using me as a crutch," Jesse said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am entirely dependent on you." Roman admitted the confession, costing him nothing. "And I don't like vulnerabilities, which is why I need you here, where I can see you, where my enemies can't reach you." "No." Jesse took a firm step back, breaking the physical contact. The loss of Roman's heat left a sudden cold void. "I have a life. I have a job. I'm not moving into your Mafia castle, so you can use me as an organic stress ball. Roman's expression hardened. The velvet trap was snapping shut. You think you're safe out there? The men who shot me know you saved me. You're already in the game, Jesse. You just don't know the rules yet. I don't play games, Jesse said, turning toward the door. Keep your men on my street if it helps you sleep, Gallagher. But stay out of my life. He walked out. Roman didn't stop him. But as Jesse walked down the long, silent hallway, he could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of the Enigma's gaze following him, a promise that this was far from over. The rain started around midnight, a cold, driving downpour that turned the city streets into slick black mirrors. Jesse hated the rain. It washed away the smog, but left the city smelling like wet concrete and garbage. He pulled the collar of his worn denim jacket up around his ears, hurrying down the steps of the hospital staff entrance. His shift had been a nightmare, a 10-car pileup on the interstate. He was covered in sweat, smelling of iodine, and exhausted down to his marrow. He just wanted his bed. The walk to the subway station was 4 blocks. Usually, Roman's black SUV was idling near the staff parking lot. Tonight, the street was empty. Jesse frowned. A cold prickle of unease washed over the back of his neck. He picked up his pace, his boots splashing through the shallow puddles. He was halfway down the second block, passing a narrow, unlit alleyway, when the scent hit him. It wasn't the ozone and ash of an Enigma. It was sour, aggressive, and reeked of stale beer and rotting meat. Unregulated alpha pheromones. Multiple sources. Jesse stopped. The hair on his arm stood up. His omega instincts, usually buried under layers of cynicism and blockers, screamed at him to run. Before he could turn, a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of him. The man was broad, wearing a leather jacket shiny with rain. He held a heavy steel pipe, tapping it slowly against his thigh. "Nurse Hayes," the man said. His voice was thick with a southern accent. He wasn't one of Roman's men. "You're a hard guy to catch alone." Jesse backed up his hand, immediately diving into his coat pocket. His fingers wrapped around the cold plastic cylinder of his medical-grade pepper spray. He bumped into a solid chest behind him. A heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jesse smelled cheap cigarettes and wet wool. "Don't run, little Omega." A second voice whispered directly into his ear. "We just want to send a message to Gallagher. Wanted to show him what happens when a stray dog touches things that belong to the Rossi family. They were the Italians, the syndicate that had put 3 bullets in Roman." Jesse didn't panic. He had survived the ER. He knew how to manage a crisis. He didn't scream. He twisted violently, bringing his elbow back hard into the ribs of the man holding his shoulder. The alpha grunted in surprise, his grip loosening just enough. Jesse spun, whipped the pepper spray up, and depressed the trigger. A thick stream of blinding chemical fire hit the alpha square in the eyes. The man shrieked, dropping to his knees, clawing at his burning face. "Get him!" the man with the pipe roared, lunging forward. Jesse turned to run, but his boots slipped on the wet pavement. He went down hard, his knee hitting the concrete with a sickening crack. Pain flared up his leg. The alpha was over him in a second. He grabbed Jesse by the collar of his jacket, hauling him half off the ground. The man raised the steel pipe. Jesse braced for the impact, squeezing his eyes shut. The blow never came. Instead, there was a sound like a heavy sack of wet meat hitting the ground. Jesse opened his eyes. The alpha who had been holding him was gone, hurled 10 feet through the air into a stack of metal trash cans. The rain seemed to stop. The air pressure in the alley simply ceased to exist. All oxygen was sucked away, replaced by a suffocating, crushing wave of absolute primal rage. It tasted like ash ozone and copper. Roman Gallagher stood in the mouth of the alley. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a heavy black overcoat completely soaked through by the rain. His pale eyes were practically glowing in the dim streetlight locked onto the remaining Alpha. The Enigma didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sheer biological weight of his fury forced the bleeding Alpha on the ground to begin retching uncontrollably. The man who had been thrown into the trash cans groaned, trying to push himself up. Roman moved. He was terrifyingly fast for a man his size. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, grabbed the Alpha by the throat, and lifted him entirely off his feet. Roman slammed the man against the brick wall. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the rainfall. The Alpha dropped to the pavement unconscious. Roman turned slowly. He looked at the man who had been hit with the pepper spray still writhing on the ground. Roman drew the heavy silver revolver from his coat. "No." Jesse croaked, his voice raw. He forced himself up onto his good leg, leaning heavily against the damp brick wall. "Roman, no. Not here." Roman froze. His hand tightened on the grip of the gun. He looked at Jesse. The absolute violence in the Enigma's eyes was horrifying. But as Roman looked at the bruise-soaked Omega, the terrifying aura began to fracture. The heavy ozone receded, pulled back on a leash of iron control. Roman holstered the gun. He walked over to Jesse, his heavy boots silent on the wet concrete. "You're bleeding," Roman stated, his voice a low, rough scrape. He reached out his thumb, gently wiping a smear of blood from a scrape on Jesse's cheekbone. "I slipped," Jesse muttered, his adrenaline crashing. His whole body began to shake. Not from the cold, but from the raw biological reality of standing next to a fully unleashed Enigma. His Omega instincts weren't screaming to run anymore. They were humming, deeply satisfied, basking in the terrifying protection of an apex predator. It made Jesse feel sick to his stomach. "They touched you," Roman whispered, his eyes dark flicking to the unconscious men. "I handled it." "No, you didn't," Roman said softly. Before Jesse could argue, Roman slid one arm behind Jesse's knees and the other around his back, lifting him effortlessly against his broad chest. Jesse gasped, grabbing onto the lapels of Roman's wet coat. "Put me down. I can walk." "Your knee is sprained. You're going into shock, and my anchor is currently shivering in an alleyway," Roman said, turning and carrying Jesse out of the dark. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The back door swung open. "Where are we going?" Jesse asked, too exhausted to fight the hold. The heat radiating off Roman's body was intoxicating, melting the chill from his bones. "Home," Roman said, stepping into the back of the SUV with Jesse still in his arms. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in the dark, quiet interior. "My apartment," Jesse started. "No," Roman interrupted smoothly, pulling Jesse closer against his chest. The Enigma buried his face into the crook of Jesse's neck right over the scent patch, breathing in a long, shuddering sigh as his nervous system finally stabilized. "You're done playing the cynic, Jesse. You're in my world now." Jesse woke to the sound of rain lashing against reinforced glass. He didn't open his eyes immediately. He lay perfectly still, taking inventory of his body. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. His right knee felt entirely encased in tight, burning concrete. And he was warm. Too warm. He was sinking into a mattress that felt like a cloud of spun silk wrapped in heavy, suffocatingly soft blankets. He cracked an eyelid. The ceiling was high-paneled in dark, rich mahogany. He wasn't in his drafty apartment. He was in Roman's estate. Jesse pushed himself up onto his elbows, biting back a sharp hiss as the movement pulled at his swollen knee. He threw back the duvet. He was dressed in a pair of soft gray sweatpants and an oversized black t-shirt that smelled heavily of amber and old paper. Roman's clothes. The door to the bedroom opened silently. Roman walked in. He wore dark slacks and a tailored black shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He carried a silver tray holding a steaming mug, a glass of water, and 2 white pills. He looked less like a Mafia king and more like a massive, lethal butler. "You're awake," Roman said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated pleasantly in Jesse's chest, a biological trick designed to soothe a distressed Omega. Jesse actively ignored it. "Did you undress me?" Jesse asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Donovan did, under my supervision. If I had touched you while you were unconscious, my instincts would have likely possessed me to keep you locked in this bed for a week." Roman set the tray on the nightstand. "Ibuprofen for the swelling." Jesse stared at the pills. Then he looked at Roman. The Enigma was standing too close. He always stood too close. The heavy gravitational pull of his aura was a constant pressure in the room, pressing against Jesse's skin, demanding acknowledgement. "I have a shift at the hospital in 4 hours, Jesse said stubbornly. He swung his good leg over the edge of the bed. "I bought the hospital." Jesse froze. He looked up, sure he had misheard. "You what?" "I made a very generous donation to the St. Jude's Board of Directors at 4 a.m. Roman said, his expression completely blank. "You are currently on indefinite paid administrative leave. Your position is secure. Your salary has been tripled." A hot spike of anger cut through Jesse's exhaustion. He grabbed the edge of the nightstand, hauling himself upright. He put weight on his right leg and instantly collapsed. Roman caught him before he hit the floor. Thick, heavy arms wrapped around Jesse's waist, hauling him flush against a solid chest. The contact was electric. Roman's core temperature was unnaturally high. The Enigma buried his face in the crook of Jesse's neck, a long, shuddering sigh escaping his lips as he inhaled the faint scent of vetiver leaking past the edges of Jesse's blocker patch. "Stop fighting me," Roman muttered against Jesse's skin. "Your knee is torn. The men who attacked you are dead. You are safe here. I am a prisoner here." Jesse snapped, shoving hard against Roman's chest. It was like pushing against a brick wall. Roman didn't budge. "You can't buy my workplace to keep me locked in a tower, Roman. That's not protection. That's a hostage situation." Roman finally pulled back, though he kept a firm grip on Jesse's hips to keep him steady. The Enigma's pale eyes were dark, stormy, with a mix of frustration and terrifying possessiveness. "The Rossi family targeted you because of me," Roman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "They thought breaking my anchor would break me. They were right. When I saw that Alpha raise his hand to you in that alley, my nervous system redlined. My heart rate spiked to 200. I almost threw a clot." Roman reached up his thumb, gently tracing the dark bruise forming on Jesse's cheekbone. "I am medically, biologically incapable of letting you walk out that door right now, Jesse. I need you where I can smell you, where I can see you breathing." Jesse stared into the pale, intense eyes of the man who supposedly ran the city's underworld. Roman wasn't posturing. There was a raw, naked vulnerability in his face that made Jesse's stomach knot. The surgery had saved Roman's life, but it had fundamentally rewired his instincts. He was an apex predator who had discovered his own off switch, and he was terrified of losing it. Jesse sighed, the fight draining out of him. He leaned heavily against Roman, conceding the physical battle, if not the war. "Ice," Jesse muttered, staring at the floor. "I need an ice pack. 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off. And if I'm staying in this overly dramatic fortress, I need my own scrubs. I hate sleeping in other people's clothes." The corner of Roman's mouth twitched upward. The oppressive, heavy aura in the room instantly lightened, melting from a suffocating weight into a warm, protective blanket. "I'll have Donovan fetch your things," Roman murmured effortlessly, scooping Jesse up and placing him back on the edge of the bed. "Drink the tea, Jesse." Jesse watched the Enigma walk out of the room. He picked up the mug. It was chamomile perfectly steeped with exactly 1 spoonful of honey. Jesse hated how much he liked it. 3 days passed. The swelling in Jesse's knee went down, replaced by a deep, ugly patchwork of yellow and purple bruising. He navigated the sprawling estate with a carbon fiber cane. Roman had procured his heavy limp a constant reminder of the violence just outside the gates. The estate was entirely self-sufficient. There was a fully stocked medical bay in the basement, a gym, and a kitchen staffed by an elderly beta woman who continuously tried to feed Jesse heavy pasta dishes. It was luxurious. It was boring. But mostly it was tense. The air in the house was a barometer of the syndicate's standing. For the first 2 days, Roman's scent was a low, steady hum of amber and old paper. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the air pressure began to drop. The smell of crushed iron and burning ozone crept into the hallways. The Rossi family was retaliating. Jesse was in the library attempting to read a medical journal when the shouting started. It came from the massive dining room across the hall, which Roman used for syndicate meetings. "They hit the docks, boss," a rough voice barked. Jesse recognized it as Declan Roman's volatile second-in-command. "2 shipments of electronics gone. 3 of our men are in the ICU. We have to hit back. Hard. Tonight." "We hold our position," Roman's voice replied. It was low, but it carried a physical vibration that rattled the glass panes of the library doors. "Hold! We look weak." Declan argued, his alpha pheromones spiking a sour, aggressive stench of rotting meat and diesel. "Ever since you got out of that hospital, you've been locked in this house." The men are talking Roman. They say the Enigma lost his nerve. They say you're hiding behind an Omega. The silence that followed was absolute. From across the hall, Jesse felt the air leave the room. He gasped, his hand flying to his chest. Roman's biological response was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Enigma's command aura exploded outward, a localized shockwave of pure predatory dominance. Jesse didn't think. He grabbed his cane and limped toward the dining room doors. He pushed them open. The scene inside was frozen in terror. 5 massive alphas were on their knees, clutching their throats, forced into total biological submission by Roman's suffocating pressure. Roman stood at the head of the long oak table. He looked monstrous. His eyes were completely dilated, swallowed by pitch black. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. His hands were braced flat on the table, the wood groaning under his grip. He was hyperventilating his chest, heaving irregularly. Jesse recognized the signs immediately. It wasn't just rage, it was a panic response. Roman's heart rate was spiking to a dangerous level, the stress of the insubordination triggering the traumatic memory of his dying organs. He was throwing himself into a neurological feedback loop. He was going to have a heart attack. "Roman," Jesse said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heavy, vibrating air like a scalpel. Roman's head snapped toward the doorway. The blackness in his eyes flickered, fighting the pale gray underneath. A low, wet growl tore from his throat. He wasn't entirely present. The Enigma instincts were driving the machine, now perceiving everything in the room as a threat to his survival. Jesse limped forward. He ignored the groaning alphas on the floor. He ignored the crushing weight in the air that screamed at his Omega biology to drop to the floor and bare his neck. He walked straight up to the head of the table. "Look at me," Jesse commanded. He reached up, his fingers bypassing Roman's jaw to press directly against the erratic hammering pulse point on the Enigma's neck. Roman flinched at the cold touch, a violent shudder ripping through his massive frame. He looked down at Jesse, his teeth bared. "Your heart is at 180. Jesse said clinically, maintaining steady, unwavering eye contact. "Your blood pressure is bottoming out. You are doing their job for them, Gallagher. You're killing yourself." "They challenged." Roman forced the words out his voice, a jagged rasp. "I don't care about their bruised egos," Jesse said. With his free hand, he reached to the collar of his shirt. He found the edge of the medical scent blocker patch. He ripped it off. He didn't just let his scent leak. He weaponized it. He forcefully projected the heavy anchoring blanket of vetiver warm honey and rain-soaked earth. He pushed it directly into the suffocating storm of Roman's ozone. The impact was physical. Roman gasped a sharp, desperate intake of air as if he had been drowning and finally broke the surface. The oppressive, lethal weight in the room evaporated, instantly replaced by the dense, calming forest of the Omega's aura. Roman's knees buckled. He slumped forward, his heavy forehead dropping to rest against Jesse's shoulder. His massive hands reached up blindly, grabbing the fabric of Jesse's shirt, anchoring himself. Jesse stood his ground, taking the Enigma's weight, though his injured knee screamed in protest. He brought his hand up to the back of Roman's head, his fingers threading through the thick, dark hair. "Breathe," Jesse whispered, the clinical detachment entirely gone from his voice. 3 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Match my breathing. You are safe. I have you. Roman followed the command. The rapid, terrifying hammer of his pulse against Jesse's fingers slowly began to decelerate. The black receded from his eyes, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. The alphas on the floor were slowly sitting up, gasping for air, staring in absolute shock. They had just watched a cynical, limping Omega leash a rampaging Enigma with nothing but a scent and a touch. Declan, pale and sweating, looked at Jesse. The aggression was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a profound biological awe. Jesse met the lieutenant's gaze over Roman's shoulder. Jesse's eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely unafraid. "The meeting is over," Jesse said, his voice hard. "Get out. If you ever push his heart rate into the red zone again, I won't bother regulating him. I'll let him crush your lungs." Declan didn't argue. He nodded sharply, scrambling to his feet. The men filed out of the dining room in total silence, leaving the doors closed behind them. Roman let out a long, ragged exhale, his breath hot against Jesse's neck. He didn't pull away. He simply wrapped his arms tighter around Jesse's waist. "They understand now," Roman murmured, his voice muffled against Jesse's skin. "They see it." "See what?" Jesse asked gently, rubbing the back of Roman's neck. "Who actually holds the power in this room?" Roman finally lifted his head. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline crash leaving him pale, but his pale gray eyes were crystal clear. He looked at Jesse not with dominance, but with a terrifying absolute reverence. "You didn't submit, Jesse. You conquered me." The war with the Rossi family ended 3 weeks later. It didn't end with a massive gunfight in the streets. It ended with precision. Roman fully stabilized and thinking clearly orchestrated a series of targeted financial strikes that crippled the Italian syndicate's shipping routes, followed by a quiet, ruthless meeting on a private tarmac. The remaining Rossi leadership surrendered their territory. Jesse watched it unfold from the sidelines. He read the tension in Roman's shoulders, smelled the faint spikes of ozone, and grounded the Enigma every night. He hadn't put a blocker patch back on since the day in the dining room. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. The rain had returned a gentle drumming against the heavy glass of the library windows. Jesse was sitting in a deep leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, a tablet in his lap. He was reviewing surgical case studies. Old habits died hard. Roman sat at his desk across the room, signing a stack of legal documents. The house was entirely silent, save for the scratch of the pen and the rain. The air between them was a comfortable, heavy mix of amber and vetiver, perfectly balanced. "Heirs called me today," Roman said suddenly, not looking up from his papers. Jesse paused, his finger hovering over the tablet screen. "Dr. Heirs, the beta surgeon from the night Roman was brought in. He says the hospital needs you." Roman continued signing the bottom of a contract with a sharp flourish. "They have a new trauma unit opening. They want you as the head charge nurse." Jesse slowly lowered the tablet. He looked at Roman. The Enigma was casually offering him the door. The cage was open. "You're giving me permission to leave?" Jesse asked, his voice neutral. Roman finally looked up. He set the pen down. He leaned back in his chair, his broad shoulders relaxing. The terrifying Mafia king looked suddenly very human and deeply tired. "I'm not giving you permission. I never had the right to keep you," Roman said quietly. "I forced you into my world because I was drowning. I used my biology to trap you. I was terrified of dying, and you were the only thing keeping me alive." Roman stood up, walking slowly around the desk. He stopped a few feet from Jesse's chair. "My nervous system is fully repaired," Roman stated, his pale eyes searching Jesse's face. "My heart doesn't panic anymore. The syndicate is stable. I don't medically require an anchor to survive." Jesse felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest that had nothing to do with biology. It was a cold, hollow realization. The job was done. The patient was discharged. "So I can go back to my drafty apartment and my stale vending machine coffee," Jesse said, gripping the edge of the tablet tightly. "You can go back to your life," Roman corrected gently. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver key. He set it on the small table next to Jesse's chair. "The apartment building you lived in. I bought it. The deed is in your name. You can kick out the dry cleaner. You can do whatever you want." Jesse stared at the key. It was freedom. It was exactly what he had fought for when he first woke up in this house. Autonomy. He thought about the emergency room, the fluorescent lights, the endless chaotic parade of broken bodies, the sterile smell of bleach. Then he looked at Roman. He looked at the faint white scar visible just below the collar of the Enigma's shirt. He remembered the feeling of Roman's massive heart slowing down under his fingertips. He remembered the profound, quiet safety of sitting in this library, knowing the most dangerous man in the city would burn the world down before letting a single drop of rain touch him. Jesse didn't want to fix broken strangers anymore. He had found his monster, and the monster was his. Jesse picked up the key. He looked at it for a long moment, the silver catching the dim light of the library. Then very deliberately, he tossed it into the empty fireplace. It clattered against the cold stone grates. Roman flinched, his eyes widening slightly. Jesse set his tablet down. He stood up, putting his weight evenly on both legs. His knee still ached on rainy days, but it held. He closed the distance between them, stepping directly into Roman's personal space. "You're an idiot, Gallagher," Jesse said, his voice a low, cynical drawl. "Jesse." "Shut up," Jesse interrupted. He reached up, grabbing the lapels of Roman's dark shirt, and pulled the massive Enigma down slightly. "You think this is a prescription? You think I took off my blockers for my health?" Roman's breath hitched. The faint smell of ozone spiked completely involuntary, revealing the Enigma's underlying panic at the rejection he thought was coming. "I don't play games, Roman," Jesse said fiercely, looking directly into the pale gray eyes. "I stayed because I wanted to. I regulate you because I choose to. You don't need an anchor to survive anymore. Fine, but you need me." Roman stared at him, the heavy calculating machinery of his mind grinding to a halt. The Enigma dropped his guard completely. His hands came up, hovering uncertainly over Jesse's waist, before pulling him in tight, burying his face in Jesse's neck with a desperate, crushing intensity. "I do," Roman rasped, his voice vibrating against Jesse's collarbone. "God, Jesse, I do." Jesse wrapped his arms around Roman's broad shoulders, his hands tangling in the dark hair. He closed his eyes, inhaling the heavy scent of amber and paper, letting his own vetiver and honey wrap around the Enigma like a permanent, unbreakable shield. "Good," Jesse murmured, a genuine, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Because I'm not moving back to that apartment. The plumbing was terrible, and your coffee is better." Roman let out a wet, huffing laugh, pulling back just enough to capture Jesse's lips in a crushing, desperate kiss. It tasted like expensive bourbon relief and absolute surrender. Jesse kissed him back. He was a nurse. He was a cynic. He was an Omega. But mostly, he was the only man in the world who held the leash to the dying Enigma king, and he wasn't ever letting go. Some patients just won't leave, and some nurses find out their bedside manner is meant for the Mafia. Jesse and Roman proved that biology isn't just about dominance. It's about finding the one person who can hold your heart together when the world tries to rip it apart. What did you think of Jesse's ultimate choice? Would you have stayed in the Enigma's fortress? Smash that like button if you love this intense Omegaverse dynamic. Share this video with your friends and hit subscribe so you never miss another deep, dark romance. Stay safe out there.